Well, hello, viewers and listeners to CHP Talks. We're here with another special guest today, Mr. Grant Abram, who is running for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. And I am broadcasting today or recording this at a Tim Hortons in Leduc, Alberta. My wife and I are on a 5-week trek across the country. And so I apologize for the background noise. I hope that the conversation will be usable. And if not, we'll re-record later. But I am in a busy environment. But Grant, thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to join us today. And I know our viewers and listeners will look forward to hearing from you. I didn't have a chance to print off an introduction, so I'm going to let you do your own introduction and how you're stepping into this race for the Conservative Party. But anyway, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Rod. I appreciate the opportunity to come and introduce myself to your listeners and to have a bit of a conversation with you about the many significant issues that are live in this country. Maybe just a bit of a background, just to say that I'm a son of Saskatchewan farming family that pioneered in Kindersley. I was born in Alberta in Edmonton and raised at the West Coast. So I feel like you're in my homeland there today, having been born in Edmonton. And I just am happy to have the discussion. I'm happily married, have 4 boys, ages 24 to 13. And they're all at different stages of education and university. And so a very happy and healthy family. And I'm very grateful for that. So happy to discuss with you, Rod, the questions you wanted to bring. And we hopefully going to have a great conversation today.
Yeah, very good. I'm going to, when I'm not speaking, I'm going to mute my microphone. I hope I don't forget to turn it back on at the appropriate time. But that way, at least the folks will hear your answers. Well, first of all, how did you get involved? What prompted you to throw your hat in the ring to jump into this race for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada? It's I know it's intense. There's quite a few names there already. And people across the country, I know, watch these races closely, and we do ourselves because we want to see, even though we're in a different party, but we want to see a good person at the helm of the Conservative Party of Canada. So maybe give us a little background, what made you decide to take this plunge?
Well, I think the answer starts with the realization that we all have our sensitivities in life. And whether you're a musician or a cook or a lawyer, there's things that you see and hear and taste first, depending on your focus. And as a lawyer, I've been watching the last 5-6 years, seeing subtle erosions in terms of due process and shifting away from the presumption of innocence in relation to our laws, and just having a sense that the principles and the frameworks that are bedrock values for this nation, freedom of speech, are coming under more and more attack and being challenged as not absolute. And then in this last 2 years, because of COVID, I believe, and I think ironically, our Prime Minister is telling us that COVID has provided us with an opportunity for a reset. There are significant changes happening in our country with assaults on those values that have been bedrock values, changes in our understanding of what our charter and rights and freedoms say. And then the last 2 years, the impact on our charter, our freedoms, our liberties, are legion. And we've seen them most recently in this last 3-4 months. And it's continuing with other legislation that is continuing to curtail I believe are inalienable rights, our sacred rights as Canadians. And the root of my answer is this, Rod, that in those last 2 years, I have heard a very muted response from the Conservative Party of Canada. I've observed a leadership framework that has forfeited, not just lost, but forfeited victory the last 2 elections. And there's obviously challenges in terms of what's going on within the leadership of the party. There seems to be a lot of disunity or doublespeak within the party. And I think that for a number of reasons, it's perhaps time for other voices to engage that discussion from the outside that aren't career politicians, that have experience doing other things and in other parts of the world. And there's no excuse for the fact that we have not been able to engage and or screaming about what has been happening to our rights and freedoms. And so that's quite an indictment actually on the incumbent MPs. And it's just not good enough from our loyal opposition.
Yeah, well, we saw that, and I'm sure that you were watching the same channel we were watching as far as what went on with the Truckers Freedom Convoy and how the government responded to that. And up until that moment of time, it seemed like the Conservative Party was relatively silent on the encroaching, the arm of government reaching in to control our lives. And anyway, during and after the Freedom Convoy took place, there were some conservative voices began to be raised. But we see people like, the Honorable Brian Peckford, who's, become a friend of ours and certainly a friend of the country, one of the crafters of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and a defender of it today. And his voice seems to, like the people in Ottawa are not even listening to this man who helped write the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And, Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, is ignoring it. And it was his father that signed it into law. And he uses the language that, we care about the Charter, but in actual fact, he totally ignores it. And especially, for us, we think of, and Brian Peckford, agreed with me on this point. The preamble says, whereas Canada is founded on principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And he said that's just as much a part. In fact, everything that follows in the Charter is based on that premise, and yet it's been ignored often by the courts, certainly by the legislature, by the Parliament. So anyway, we thank you for taking up the challenge to help defend rights and freedom, especially freedom of speech, because without that we have nothing. So I'll let you talk a bit more about that and maybe get into what happened with C4 and why there was no really official opposition when C4 was rammed through Parliament.
Okay, well, look, let me just break that down into three questions then. One is the Conservative response to the convoy. Two is the preamble to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the third one is a comment on the conversion therapy bill C4. So, well, first of all, in relation to the truckers and the convoy, my own perception of that was a fairly amazing expression of Canadian values and freedom for our nation, despite perhaps the inconvenience that was felt by the parking of trucks in Ottawa and what that meant. The values that they were articulating by their peaceful demonstration were values that are deeply rooted in this nation in terms of freedom of thought and expression and freedom of movement and medical privacy. And every one of those issues has its own rabbit trail of conversation that we could go down today. But I think maybe what I'll do is limit my comment to this. I think for me, when I observed those events and in the run up to the invocation of the emergency powers, we saw a Conservative Party who suddenly awakened to the fact that there was a freedom issue being discussed with the truckers, and the party's line seemed to be, we support freedom in Canada. And then within 2 days, the position seemed to change, and the comment was made that the truckers have been heard, it's time to go home, and the Conservative Party is the party of law and order. And I think probably many Canadians' guts turned when they saw the duality of that position within 72 hours. And there was a momentum there that suddenly created a massive disconnect for the party. And so my view is that I think what the truckers were doing amplified and expressed the values that I think we need to be talking about in the nation. And it's not just about a bit more money in our pockets or lowering taxes. The truckers did not go down to Ottawa because there was an issue of not enough money in their pockets or they weren't arguing about taxes. They were heartfelt root value issues that define their expressions that define what this nation is about. And to airbrush over them now, even in this campaign, is a tragedy, because it's actually what the stakes are in this leadership discussion for the nation. So, and that brings me to the second question, which was your comment about Mr. Peckford and his lawsuit in relation to the Freedom of Movement lawsuit, and his comments on the preamble of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is, as you stated, that this nation's built upon principle and foundations of the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And I find that a lot of Canadians, well, first of all, the supremacy of God is the source of our inalienable rights as Canadians. They're God-given, they're government-given. And it's an interesting dialogue when I speak to Canadians about this, because if you start to bring God into the conversation, it's almost like there's a secular component in their brain that doesn't want to talk about it because they hear the term God. But we can secularize the reality of those rights as being inalienable without camping out on a discussion of God. I mean, there's all kinds of legal theorists or philosophers who have talked about the moral civic code that allows a nation to function, to thrive, to grow, to gain wealth, to have its citizens secure. In our case, it's a Judeo-Christian moral civic code, and we have done very well with it, as have all of the other developed countries in the world, in terms of increasing wealth and prosperity and having strong democracies. So we don't need to talk about our historical roots in the sense of people being turned off by God. It's not a desire to have the notion of God pushed down people's throats. It's deriving the value of the principles that were set in from a Judeo-Christian ideology. And that is where our nation has been blessed and where we've thrived. And that's the discussion that's not happening. And, you know, there's a legal philosopher called Hobbes, who recognized that when there's not a kind of a moral civic framework that guides how people work, function, and formulate society together, life becomes nasty, brutish, and short. And that's what will happen if we leave our foundation stones. So I'm a big advocate for those foundation stones, because they set a civic moral order that allows our country to thrive, regardless of your views on religion. And the Liberal government, in its advance of this new social contract, as I refer it, is wanting that to be forgotten or airbrushed out, because they're fundamentally changing how the nation functions and moving it away from what is classic liberalism, which is actually where the Conservative Party is in terms of individual freedoms, small government, and empowered citizens. And they want to have a dependent citizenry with a bloatsome government. And that is the root system of our challenges here in Canada. So that's number two. Do we want to stop at number two and just maybe ask further on that? Because there's a lot with C4 too, so I'll be talking nonstop.
Sure. Well, I'll jump in a little bit. We were really concerned. we people in our party, the Christian Heritage Party, and a lot of friends of ours, wherever they're at in the political spectrum, as far as partisan loyalty, we're very concerned about the passage of C4, which, the government has been pushing in that direction for some time, this Liberal government. And we expect it, even though the Liberals and the NDP, they're working together with a social agenda that we think is terrible for our country. And this is just one aspect of it. But we were expecting the Conservative members of Parliament to at least oppose this, to use all their strength and energy to protect the rights of parents to raise their children according to their own conscience and beliefs, and also to protect the rights of pastors and counselors to work with men and women who may want to return to a lifestyle consistent with their gender at birth, right? So anyway, so we were quite surprised, shocked actually, that this bill was basically pushed through in one session with not a single voice of opposition raised. And that raises a lot of questions. How did that happen? Who was twisting whose arm, and so on. But anyway, you and I had a little chat beforehand about this, and just invite you to give us your perspective. What happened with C4 and how it should have been handled differently?
Well, I wasn't privy, obviously, to what happened before that meeting, or whether someone was surprised or bullied into taking that position. But the fact remains that no one actually stood up and said no to that. Whether you abstained or voted for it, it was essentially of the same effect in relation to that particular passing of that bill. The bitter irony for Canadians now is that we face a legal scenario where one acquires a penalty of 3 years in prison if you sexually assault a child. But if you are a parent who's seeking to steward, guide, help your child in understanding their sexuality, and there is an engagement of that assistance by either a parent or a counselor or a pastor of a church, that person that's seeking to help that child in their journey of understanding faces 5 years in prison. And that's just, it really is shocking that is the case. And when you compare and contrast that with the fact that there is a framework within our education system that actually, if that issue is actually raised within the education system, the child is drawn into the system because the educators aren't entitled to communicate the child's disclosure on the issue of their sexuality to their parents. And so there's a suctioning in to a favoring of a care ecosystem that takes the child away from their parents and that infrastructure. So there's always those slippery slope arguments that are made to argue why that should be the case. But from my own perspective, the parental authority is a preeminent issue, and the government shouldn't be raising our children. Our parents should, including orientating them in ideology and faith. And so these are big issues for the country. And the fact that we had people empowered, and I'll even go as far as politically to say socially conservative people empowered in that room, who did not take a position to oppose this for whatever reason, is a sad indictment, I think, on where we're at as a party in terms of having the confidence to have a freedom of consciousness in a vote. Freedom of conscience, in a vote.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we support every effort, of course, we in our party to protect freedom of conscience. I think it's without freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, those types of things, we do not have a democracy. So before we, we're going to come to an end at some point here. I really want to get to one of the questions one of the most important ones for myself and for our viewers and listeners is your position on pro-life matters, on abortion, euthanasia, and I, have chosen or desired to interview all the Conservative Party candidates who express a pro-life worldview, concern for those issues. And I knew that about you, and that was why I reached out to you. So maybe I'll just open it for you to discuss those issues, how you see them, what you think the path forward would be within your party and within the country, and what do you think the voters of this country and especially the voters, the members of the Conservative Party of Canada are prepared to do to protect innocent human life at both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I would reference these comments, is life at both ends of the spectrum. I see life as sacrosanct. But before I go down to maybe define my perspective, I'm seeking leadership of a party at the moment that is pro-choice. So I just want to acknowledge that my views on the vulnerability of life are personal views. And they come with me as part of the package of engaging the leadership of the party. So there's my disclaimer, my disclosure in terms of recognizing that that's the current status. I think that the reality is in Canada that we have no law on abortion, and it's perfectly reasonable to have that conversation in Canada. And I think that that's a discussion that needs to happen within the membership, the policy committee membership of the Conservative Party, and have it engaged there and see what the actual appetite is with Canadians to have that reviewed within the party. And so this issue seems to be such a lightning rod issue on both ends of the spectrum, with both within the party and certainly outside the party. Canada is facing much bigger, what I would call much bigger macro issues in terms of our existence and our sovereignty right now. But my view on life is that it's sacrosanct, and it shouldn't be tampered with. That would shape my discussion. I'd like to see late-term abortions be stopped and move to maybe a marker that's much more reasonable. I think, again, that's a discussion for Canadians to have. And in terms of euthanasia, I think we should support hospice care and pain management in terms of the passing of life. But I don't think that we should be engaging with accelerants to assist that journey in whatever nuanced way that they're discussed. So I think that's as clear as I know to be on either ends of that spectrum, as you've articulated.
Thank you for that, Grant. And one other topic we should cover, and then probably we're going to be running to the end of this particular discussion. Hopefully we'll have you back at some future time. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on the national debt, which is now about $1.2 trillion, how we got there. And you know that I'm in a party that supports mandatory balanced budgets, so that's where I'm coming from. But the debt has grown under both Conservative and Liberal governments. I should say NDP Liberal now. I should actually hyphenate that. That's the reality. We have an NDP Liberal majority, and they seem to think that money grows on trees. But we did even see an increase in our debt, not nearly as drastic, but there was an increase under Stephen Harper, who was the last Conservative Prime Minister. And what is your approach to managing debt and deficit spending and balancing the budget, and those? What are your thoughts along those lines?
Well, my thoughts start with the ideological approach to our nation and its debt, because what we have going on right now is a new social contract that is moving the country towards dependence in terms of individual or family sustainability. So the discussion about debt is that we're in a huge hole, probably a multi-generational hole when you look at it. And we've curtailed our greatest engines in relation to the nation because of the framework that has rolled into this country through COVID. So we need to unleash our engines again in this nation, including the energy sector. We need to get rid of the carbon tax and reduce the inflationary impact of household spending and get some of the prices down in this country. We need to move back to innovation and rewarding creators of ideas, particularly even within the energy sector. We need to look at our agri-food sector differently and start to empower and value add. There's so many sectors that actually just need to be unchained and allow entrepreneurs to come back and breathe life into the nation, because we're a pioneering nation, but we've had a government and a system really in the last 20 years that hasn't protected our intellectual property and hasn't protected that innovative, creative spirit. So there's a coupling of a whole load of issues here in engaging our debt. I don't think that the answer in year one, if I'm leading the Conservative Party, is to move to a strict austerity because we have to eradicate all debt. We actually want to be spending on our infrastructure that will empower the nation to grow and pull out of this hole that we're in. And that also means returning a manufacturing base to Canada, returning to the building of industry again. So we're not totally dependent on global supply chains. We need to look at getting our Canadians employed. So one of the ideas that I have and I'm working on as a policy is to empower Canadian companies with credits to actually hire Canadians rather than offshoring parts of their service provision to foreign countries or call centers or remote IT infrastructure, and bringing that employment back into Canada and rewarding companies for hiring Canadians. And so it's all of these things. And as they align and contribute to our national energy, we will begin to move out of that debt. And I think there needs to be some fairly canny stewardship of how we structure our debt and manage it. And those are some discussions that I think the nation needs to have. But I'm for empowerment of the individual and the family and communities, and seeing people move to self-sufficiency, not dependency on the government through universal income, because that isn't how this nation is built, and it's not going to be what carries us into the future.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for bringing in the universal basic income, which is the strangest idea that I can imagine that would ever be brought up in the House of Commons and in the Senate. And there are two bills identical to each other that would do just that. And I, it's hard to believe that grown adults would come up with a scheme whereby you start paying 17-year-olds as if they were working, and not giving them the incentive to either complete their education and raise their skill level, or actually to get out and get their hands dirty and start, contributing to society. So thank you for that.
Well,
Grant, I'm going to give you a chance to say any closing comments, but before we do that, where do people find out more about you? Your website and your bio and things like that they might like to know. Just
sure. Well, I was just going to say, and just to finish off that last conversation, we talk about issues of universal income as though it's social policy. And I think we should be more precise in our language, because part of what's happening to the nation is the country's losing its moorings because the language is shifting all the time. And it's not actually social policy, it's socialist policy. And so, yeah, I think we have to be careful and watch for those little nuances that are happening to all of us in terms of those subtle changes that are actually what is providing the accelerant to this new social contract in the nation that the Liberal government's rolling out. And we need to resist fervently as Canadians, because it's actually ebbing away or etching away at our sovereignty as a people. To find me, my website is www.canadaspromise.com. There's no apostrophe S in this, just Canada's Promise. And all the various links are in there, including information sheets, bios, and nomination forms, donation forms. It's all there, so you can find me there.
So just one final question. Where are you at in terms of your deadlines for, becoming accepted as a candidate? Do you have some financial hurdles and those types?
Yeah, I do. The first hurdle was actually yesterday, which was $50,000. We've surpassed that, but at the moment by about 20,000. And this next 10 days is really important. And so I'm unapologetic about asking that if you are looking for someone that will contend for responsible, prudent fiscal management in relation to this nation, as well as finding the symmetry of social policy that resonates with Canadians, including the ones that we've talked about, I'd ask you for your support, because we need to change how we're doing business within the Conservative government, or there's going to continue to be fragmentation. And so I want to work towards reunifying the party, and we need all the disenfranchised voices that are out there in Canada to re-engage within the party to shape the leadership, because the Conservative Party is the only party that will present itself as a government in waiting and win the next general election. We need to do that. And so we need your support in this leadership race as well. And I hope I haven't offended any of your CHP voters by saying that.
That's a fair statement from a person who's running for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada, and I'm not going to turn this into a debate about that. I am speaking across the country on the topic of restoring our Christian culture, pragmatism, populism, or principle. So people can find out more about us, of course, by coming to chp.ca. But this interview is about Grant Abraham and his quest to become the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, and we certainly appreciate taking the time today to meet with us, Grant. We wish you good success on the trail as far as enjoying the process as well as the end result, because it's important to get these ideas out there. And obviously there's 10 or 11 of you contending for that leadership. They're not all going to become the leader, but one of you will. And we hope that the ideas that you've been talking about, that we care about, would be ideas that will be reflected in the future of the Conservative Party of Canada. So thank you for joining us today.
It's a sincere privilege to have had the conversation with you today, Rod. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the background noise here at the Tim Hortons in Leduc, but it is a great place. If it's not the greatest studio, but it's a great place to get a good cup of coffee. So some of you I will be seeing on my way across the country, and I look forward to meeting with you to discuss some of these issues as well. So thanks again, and God bless you all. Tune in again next week for another edition of CHP Talks.